December 18, 1974. Northern Morotai Island, Indonesia. The jungle breathes in the humid equatorial heat. A man emerges from the forest's edge, wary eyes scanning the clearing ahead. His uniform, once Imperial Japanese Army standard issue, now hangs in tatters from his lean frame. The cloth has been patched countless times with local materials, bark fiber, woven grasses, strips of salvaged fabric. His rifle, a Type 99 Arisaka bolt-action, remains clean and functional despite 3 decades of jungle humidity. Slung across his back is a handcrafted bamboo canteen, and at his hip hangs a military knife, its edge worn from years of survival use. Private Teruo Nakamura watches the Indonesian military search party from the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. For a man who has spent 30 years in isolation, the sight of uniformed men speaking a language he barely comprehends sends conflicting signals of danger and hope through his weary mind. At 55 years old, Nakamura's face is weathered by tropical sun and hardship. Deep lines etched around eyes that have maintained their vigilance since 1944. His beard, streaked with grey, reaches his collarbone. His hair, though unkempt, is kept short with his knife. His hands, once soft from his life as an Aboriginal farmer in Taiwan, now bear calluses thick as leather. The Indonesian soldiers wave a Japanese flag and call out through loudspeakers. The words drift through humid air toward Nakamura's position. The sounds are Japanese, a language he knows from his military service, but not his native tongue. He is an Amis tribesman from Taiwan, conscripted into service for an emperor thousands of miles away. He listens intently, processing the unexpected message. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. You can come home. For 3 decades, Nakamura has dismissed similar messages as enemy propaganda. He has hidden when search parties passed. He has maintained his lonely post on this foreign island, following his last orders: never surrender, never be captured alive. But today, something is different. Perhaps it's the exhaustion of 30 years. Perhaps it's the unmistakable authenticity in the traditional songs they play. Perhaps it's simply time. Nakamura steps from the jungle's protective embrace into the clearing. The Indonesian soldiers freeze, stunned by the apparition before them. One of history's last living ghosts has materialized. The soldier raises his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in a gesture of cautious greeting. He doesn't yet know that in stepping from that forest, he is stepping into history, the last confirmed Japanese holdout of World War II, a war that ended when Harry Truman was president and Winston Churchill still led Britain. What Teruo Nakamura cannot possibly understand, as he approaches the search party with disciplined, measured steps, is that he is about to become something far more complex than a returned soldier. He will become a symbol of duty, of isolation, of a changed world wrestling with the aftermath of humanity's largest conflict, and most poignantly, a symbol of honor in an age that struggles to define it. Tamazato Village, eastern Taiwan. Rain falls on bamboo rooftops as a child's cry pierces the dawn. Atun Palalin is born into the Amis tribe in the Japanese colony of Taiwan. The island has been under Japanese rule since 1895, when China ceded it following defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War. For the aboriginal peoples of Taiwan, one colonial power has simply replaced another. The Amis, the largest indigenous group on the island, have inhabited the eastern coastal plains and mountains for centuries. Their society is matrilineal, with property passed through the mother's line and family names carried by women. They live by agriculture, hunting and fishing, with elaborate ceremonies marking the seasons and life stages. Atun's childhood unfolds in this dual world, the traditional rhythms of tribal life alongside the increasing presence of Japanese colonial administration. In his village, elders still practice ancient rituals and pass down oral histories. Men hunt wild boar in the mountains and fish in coastal waters. Women tend to terraced fields of millet, sweet potatoes, and taro. His father, a respected hunter, teaches him to track animals and read the forest signs. His mother, skilled in traditional weaving, imparts patience and precision. From his grandmother, he learns the stories of Amis' origins, how their ancestors emerged from a stone in the mountains, how they came to this eastern shore. By age 7, he attends a Japanese colonial school, where he is assigned the name Teruo Nakamura, part of the systematic effort to assimilate Taiwan's indigenous population. Here he learns rudimentary Japanese, basic arithmetic, and receives heavy doses of imperial propaganda. The teachers emphasize loyalty to the emperor and the superiority of Japanese culture, attempting to disconnect children from their indigenous identities. Despite this pressure, Atun maintains his connection to Amis traditions. At night, in the family's simple wooden home, he speaks his native language and participates in community gatherings where the old ways persist. During the annual harvest festival, he joins other young men in traditional dances, celebrating the bounty of the land and honoring ancestral spirits. The 1930s bring increasing militarization as Japan prepares for expansion into China and Southeast Asia. The colonial administration tightens control over Taiwan's resources and population. Indigenous communities face heightened pressure to assimilate, with restrictions on traditional practices and language use. As a teenager, Atun works in the family's agricultural fields and occasionally takes odd jobs with Japanese construction projects. He witnesses the building of military facilities and the increasing presence of troops on the island. Taiwan is being transformed into a staging area for Japan's imperial ambitions. In early adulthood, Atun marries a young woman from a neighboring village in a traditional Amis ceremony. Their union follows custom, with the groom moving to the bride's community. He works diligently to establish himself as a reliable provider, farming a small plot of land and hunting in the surrounding mountains. When his young wife becomes pregnant in 1943, Atun envisions a simple future continuing the ways of his ancestors. But larger historical forces are already spiraling toward him, about to pull him from these ancestral mountains into a global conflict whose scale and purpose he can scarcely comprehend. Japanese officials appear in the village one autumn day, listing names of men to be volunteered for military service. The empire, facing increasing pressure across the Pacific, needs manpower. Indigenous Taiwanese, with their knowledge of tropical environments and physical endurance, are viewed as valuable assets for jungle warfare. Atun, now called exclusively by his Japanese name Teruo Nakamura in official contexts, receives the conscription notice with stoic acceptance. Resistance is futile and would bring punishment to his family and village. His wife, heavily pregnant, helps prepare his few belongings. The community holds a modest ceremony, invoking ancestral protection for their departing son. On the morning of his departure, Nakamura climbs a nearby hill to look once more at the mountains that have cradled his people for generations. He performs a simple ritual, leaving an offering of rice and asking the ancestors for safe return. Below, mist clings to the terraced fields and forest edges, the landscape that has defined his identity and world. Hours later, he boards a military transport with other indigenous conscripts. As the vehicle pulls away, the mountains recede behind him. He doesn't know that he is seeing his homeland for the last time as a young man, that when he returns, if he returns, both he and Taiwan will be transformed beyond recognition. The ancestral mountains, keepers of Amis traditions and identity, fade into the distance. Ahead lies an imperial war machine that will convert this tribal hunter into an imperial soldier, sending him to a distant island where he will keep faith with an unintended duty far longer than anyone could possibly imagine. November 1943. Imperial Japanese Army Training Base, Southern Taiwan. Drill instructors shout commands as new conscripts struggle to maintain formation in the morning heat. Teruo Nakamura stands at attention among rows of other Taiwanese aboriginals, now uniformed and shorn of their traditional hairstyles. The transformation from tribal villager to imperial soldier is proceeding with mechanical efficiency. These men, accustomed to the freedom of mountain life, now exist within a rigid hierarchy of commands, punishments, and absolute obedience. His military training is brief and pragmatic. The Pacific War has turned against Japan. The empire needs bodies on far-flung islands to slow the American advance. Cultural indoctrination emphasizes loyalty to the emperor and the supreme dishonor of surrender. Nakamura learns the basics of weapons handling, fieldcraft, and military discipline. The way of the warrior is found in death. Instructors quote from the Hagakure, the classical samurai text. When it comes to either or, there is only the quick choice of death. These concepts are foreign to Nakamura's tribal worldview, yet they are hammered into him daily. He absorbs what he needs to survive, but maintains his distinct identity. Unlike many imperial soldiers from mainland Japan, he has no deep cultural connection to Bushido code or the divine emperor mythology. He is a tribesman in borrowed uniform, fighting another man's war. The Takasago Volunteer Unit, composed primarily of Taiwanese aboriginals, occupies a particular place in the imperial military structure. The Japanese command values these indigenous soldiers for their physical endurance, familiarity with mountainous terrain, and skill in jungle survival. Yet they are also viewed with underlying racial prejudice, considered useful but culturally inferior to ethnic Japanese troops. During training, Nakamura demonstrates natural aptitude for the skills most relevant to jungle warfare. His marksmanship is adequate, but his abilities to move silently through vegetation, construct shelters from natural materials, and identify edible plants mark him as especially valuable for deployment to the Southern Front. By early 1944, Imperial Japan is in strategic retreat across the Pacific. American forces under General MacArthur are advancing northward through New Guinea and the Philippines. Japan rushes to fortify its defensive perimeter. Within months of his conscription, Private Nakamura is shipped to Morotai Island in what was then the Dutch East Indies. The teardrop-shaped island, approximately 1,800 square kilometers of dense jungle and volcanic terrain, sits between Halmahera and the Philippines. Its strategic location makes it a critical link in Japan's defensive chain. The voyage south is Nakamura's first experience at sea. The troop transport moves cautiously, constantly alert for American submarines. Many soldiers suffer from seasickness, but Nakamura adapts quickly, spending hours on deck watching the changing skies and waters. Though headed toward combat, this journey represents the furthest this mountain villager has ever traveled from his homeland. Nakamura's unit arrives on Morotai in mid-1944. Their mission is straightforward: defend the island against Allied invasion, conduct guerrilla operations if overrun, and never surrender. The latter order will echo in Nakamura's mind for decades to come. Upon arrival, Nakamura helps construct defensive positions along the island's beaches and inland approaches. The Japanese forces, numbering approximately 500 men, prepare for the invasion they know is coming. They dig bunkers, plant mines, and establish supply caches in the interior mountains. The commanding officers emphasize that every soldier is expected to die in place rather than surrender or retreat. Meanwhile, Nakamura sends letters back to Taiwan when military transport allows. His writing, simple and direct, expresses hope for his family's well-being and inquires about his newborn child, whom he has never seen. These letters will stop reaching his family after the Allied invasion, though he will continue writing them for years, storing them in his jungle shelter, letters to ghosts from a ghost. The Americans land on Morotai in overwhelming force on September 15, 1944. The battle is brief but fierce. Most Japanese defenders are killed or captured, but some escape into the island's mountainous interior. By November, the Americans have secured their objectives, the coastal areas and airfields. They establish a base that will support their Philippine campaign, but make limited efforts to clear the island's rugged interior of remaining Japanese troops. Deep in the jungle, Nakamura joins a band of surviving Japanese soldiers. Their commander maintains discipline and purpose. They will continue fighting through guerrilla tactics, awaiting reinforcements that never come. As months pass, disease and injuries thin their ranks. Communications with Japanese command cease. They are alone, forgotten on an island that history has already passed by. The survivors establish a hidden camp near a freshwater stream, constructing crude shelters and organizing regular patrols. They occasionally ambush small American units or raid supply depots for medicine, ammunition, and food. Each raid is carefully planned and executed, avoiding unnecessary risks that might further deplete their dwindling numbers. Nakamura's jungle skills prove invaluable in this environment. He helps locate edible plants, set animal traps, and navigate the difficult terrain. Though technically subordinate to Japanese officers, his practical knowledge gives him a unique status within the group. When malaria and dysentery sweep through the camp in early 1945, Nakamura's knowledge of medicinal plants helps several men survive. The war's end in August 1945 passes without their knowledge. No official surrender order reaches their isolated position. American forces begin to withdraw from Morotai, transferring control to returning Dutch colonial authorities and eventually to independent Indonesian forces after 1949. Through these transitions, the Japanese holdouts remain hidden, committed to a war that has already entered the history books. The commander's death in 1946 fractures the group. Some want to surrender, others remain committed to resistance. Nakamura stays with the holdouts, eventually becoming part of a smaller band of diehards who continue to live as soldiers at war. Occasionally, they encounter evidence that something has changed in the outside world. Aircraft with unfamiliar markings fly overhead. Local villages display flags they don't recognize. Yet without official orders or reliable information, they maintain their mission. Years pass, and the band grows smaller through death, desertion, and despair. In 1956, after more than a decade in the jungle, Nakamura makes a fateful decision. He separates from his remaining comrades, weary of the interpersonal conflicts and strategic disagreements that have intensified as years passed without contact from Japan. He moves to a remote valley and establishes a small compound, a 20 by 30 meter clearing surrounded by a bamboo fence. Inside, he builds a hut raised on stilts to avoid flooding in the rainy season. He cultivates a garden with sweet potatoes, bananas, and taro. He sets traps for wild game and fashions tools from available materials. He is now truly alone, one man maintaining a private war on an island that has long forgotten the conflict. His daily routine is dictated by survival needs, military discipline, and vigilance against perceived enemies. He avoids local villages and the occasional Indonesian patrols, living as a shadow in the forest. While world leaders rise and fall, while nations forge alliances and break them, while technologies transform human society, Teruo Nakamura remains frozen in 1944, a forgotten warrior following orders that no one remembers giving, fighting a war that history has long since concluded. Morotai Island. 14 years after the American invasion, Teruo Nakamura kneels beside a small stream, patiently repairing a fish trap woven from jungle vines. His isolated existence has evolved into a disciplined routine. He rises before dawn, checks his perimeter for signs of intrusion, then attends to his garden and traps. His compound has expanded over the years to include a storage hut for preserved foods and salvaged items, a covered area for working during rainy season, and a lookout platform in a tall tree that offers views across the valley. The practical aspects of survival consume most of his energy. He maintains his garden meticulously, understanding that his life depends on its productivity. He cultivates native plants but also grows Japanese varieties from seeds he had carried with him during the retreat into the jungle. His diet consists primarily of vegetables, fruits, small game, fish, and occasionally wild boar when hunting proves successful. Nakamura's military vigilance never wavers. He conducts regular patrols around his territory, noting any unusual signs. He maintains defensive positions and escape routes. His rifle remains his most prized possession, cleaned daily and used sparingly to conserve ammunition. He has become so attuned to the forest that he can detect an approaching human from hundreds of meters away by subtle changes in wildlife behavior. His clothing has long since deteriorated beyond repair. He fashions new garments from a combination of bark cloth, animal hides, and salvaged fabric. His boots have been replaced by handcrafted sandals. Yet despite these adaptations, he maintains elements of military discipline in his appearance, keeping his beard trimmed and his living space orderly. Time is marked not by calendars but by natural cycles, the monsoon seasons, the fruiting of certain trees, the migrations of birds. Nakamura has lost track of official dates years ago, though he still notes the approximate anniversaries of significant events in his life: his conscription, the American landing, the commander's death, his decision to separate from the group. The psychological toll of such profound isolation would have broken many men. Nakamura combats the crushing loneliness through rigid routine and purpose. He keeps a daily log using charcoal on bark sheets, recording weather conditions, food supplies, and security observations. The practice maintains his literacy skills and provides a sense of continuity. In moments of rare leisure, Nakamura carves small figurines from wood, animals, people from his memories, scenes from his homeland. These creations serve as companions of sorts, populating his solitary world with representations of the connections he has lost. Language itself becomes a challenge. With no one to speak to, Nakamura develops the habit of talking aloud to himself in a mixture of his native Amis language and military Japanese. Sometimes he recites from memory the folk stories his grandmother told him, or the military regulations drilled into him during training. Words become precious things, to be used carefully lest they slip away entirely. There are moments when his resolve wavers. After a particularly severe bout of malaria in 1962, delirious with fever, Nakamura considers surrendering to the nearest village. But ingrained military discipline and fear prevail. The instruction never to be captured alive had been burned into his consciousness. Even when Indonesian or Australian search parties passed nearby in the 1960s, he hides silently, watching from concealed positions as they call out that the war is over. "But propaganda," he whispers to himself as they pass, a trick to capture Japanese soldiers. Occasionally, he finds items left by these search parties, newspapers, leaflets, food packages. He studies them with suspicion but can't fully comprehend their significance. One leaflet showing Emperor Hirohito in Western clothing beside American military leaders particularly confuses him. It seems like obvious enemy manipulation, a crude attempt to demoralize Japanese soldiers. As years pass, Nakamura observes changes in the island that he can't explain. Strange aircraft with unfamiliar markings fly overhead. Distant mechanical sounds reach his valley, suggesting construction or resource extraction. Local villagers he occasionally observes from hiding wear different clothing styles than he remembered from the war years. These anomalies create growing cognitive dissonance. If Japan had won the war, wouldn't there be evidence of Japanese authority on the island? If Japan had lost, why had no official surrender order reached him? The uncertainty gnaws at him, but in the absence of definitive information, he defaults to his last clear orders: maintain position, continue resistance, never surrender. In the 1970s, the outside world begins to encroach more directly on Nakamura's sanctuary. Logging operations expand into previously untouched parts of the island. Indonesian military patrols increase as part of national integration efforts. The buffer zone between Nakamura and civilization gradually shrinks. In early 1974, he has a close encounter with a hunting party from a nearby village. Hidden in dense undergrowth, he watches as they pass within meters of his position. Their casual demeanor and hunting focus suggest they are not searching for him specifically, yet their proximity alarms him. That night, he decides to relocate his compound deeper into the mountains, away from the increasingly trafficked areas. The move requires abandoning years of careful cultivation and construction. His garden, with its established plants and familiar rhythms, must be left behind. His shelter, weatherproofed through countless rainy seasons, will be replaced by a temporary lean-to until he can build something more substantial. It is a profound disruption to the carefully ordered world he has created. As he gathers essential items for the relocation, Nakamura experiences a rare moment of existential doubt. Why continue this solitary mission? What purpose does his vigilance serve after so many years? The questions surface briefly before military discipline reasserts itself. Orders are orders. Duty is absolute. His personal doubts are irrelevant to the mission. By late 1974, Nakamura has established a new, smaller compound in a remote valley. The transition has been challenging, forcing him to expend considerable energy on basic survival needs again. His health, though still remarkably good for a man who has lived 3 decades in the jungle without medical care, shows signs of strain. He loses weight. A persistent cough develops during the rainy season. It is in this somewhat weakened state that Nakamura first notices the increased air traffic above his new location in November 1974. Indonesian military helicopters conduct systematic grid patterns over the island's interior. Though he doesn't know it, these flights are part of a deliberate search operation, triggered by a pilot's chance sighting of his abandoned compound during a routine training exercise. As November turns to December, Nakamura senses that something has changed. The helicopter flights become more frequent and focused. On clear days, he can see them hovering over specific areas, including locations near his former compound. His instincts, honed by decades of survival, tell him that he is being hunted. With limited options for further retreat, Nakamura prepares for what he believes may be his final stand. He cleans his rifle and counts his remaining ammunition, just 26 rounds after 30 years. He establishes multiple escape routes from his compound and prepares defensive positions. If this is indeed the end of his long vigil, he is determined to face it with the discipline and purpose that have sustained him through 30 years of solitude. What he cannot know, as he prepares for this perceived final confrontation, is that the approaching encounter will not end his story, but rather begin a new chapter, one that will transform this forgotten soldier into an unexpected symbol for a world that has moved on without him. March 1974. Lubang Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda surrenders his sword to his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. 9 months before Nakamura's discovery, another Japanese holdout emerges from isolation to worldwide attention. Lieutenant Onoda, an intelligence officer who had held out in the jungles of Lubang since 1944, surrenders only after his former commander personally relieves him of duty. The ceremony is formal, emotional, and heavily publicized. Onoda weeps as he hands over his sword, telling reporters, "I am ashamed that I have returned alive." Onoda's story captivates global media. Here is a perfect embodiment of Bushido's uncompromising loyalty, a Japanese officer who continued fighting for 29 years out of devotion to emperor and country. His surrender occurs only because he receives direct orders from his superior, maintaining the chain of command that defines traditional Japanese military values. The Onoda narrative unfolds with cinematic precision. He returns to Japan as a hero, received by Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka and cheered by crowds waving rising sun flags. Publishers compete for his memoir rights. Television programs celebrate his dedication and sacrifice. In a Japan struggling to reconcile its imperial past with its economic present, Onoda represents a comforting vision of traditional values preserved against the corrosive forces of modernity. But Onoda is merely the most recent in a long line of Japanese holdouts who have emerged from the jungles of the Pacific in the decades following World War II. On Guam in January 1972, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi is discovered by local hunters while fishing in a river. After 28 years in hiding, he emerges with a handcrafted uniform and the declaration, "It is with much embarrassment that I return alive." His first question upon returning to Japan, "Is the Emperor well?" Yokoi becomes a media sensation, though his status as a sergeant rather than an officer, and his admission that he knew the war had ended but was too ashamed to surrender, makes his story slightly less aligned with samurai ideals than Onoda's later narrative. In 1950, on Lubang Island, where Onoda would later be found, Captain Fumio Nakahara surrenders after years of isolation. Unlike Onoda, who would continue holding out on the same island for another 24 years, Nakahara accepts the evidence of Japan's defeat and returns home. His earlier surrender generates less media attention, occurring during the Korean War when Japan's relationship with its wartime past remains raw and unprocessed. Even earlier, in 1946, just months after Japan's formal surrender, a group of 33 Japanese soldiers emerged from caves on Peleliu in the Palau archipelago. Led by Lieutenant Yamaguchi, they surrender only after a Japanese admiral personally assures them of the war's end. Their relatively quick acceptance of defeat generates limited public interest, as Japan struggles with immediate post-war occupation and reconstruction. Perhaps most dramatically, in 1951, a group of 19 Japanese soldiers and civilians are discovered on Anatahan, a small, uninhabited island in the northern Marianas. Their story includes not just military holdouts, but also the sole woman in the group, Kazuko Higa, whose presence creates complex social dynamics over the years of isolation. The Anatahan affair, with its elements of romance, conflict and survival, inspires a 1953 film by Josef von Sternberg, The Saga of Anatahan, bringing the holdout phenomenon to international cinema audiences. Each of these emergences follows a pattern: initial discovery, verification of identity, formal surrender, repatriation, and media coverage. Each generates questions about duty, psychological adaptation, and the lingering shadows of Imperial Japan. Each becomes, in its way, a mirror reflecting contemporaneous attitudes toward Japan's wartime past. By 1974, with most known Japanese military holdouts having been discovered or declared dead, experts believe few, if any, remain in the Pacific's jungles. Onoda's March surrender is widely reported as marking the end of this historical phenomenon. Japanese officials consider the chapter closed, the last living ghosts of the empire's collapse finally laid to rest. So when reports reach Tokyo in November 1974 that Indonesian authorities have possibly located another holdout on Morotai, the reaction is one of surprise and some skepticism. Could another soldier have truly survived, unknown and undetected, for nearly 3 decades? Unlike Onoda, this rumored holdout is not an officer from mainland Japan, but allegedly a Taiwanese aboriginal conscript, a crucial distinction in the hierarchy of imperial memory. While Onoda perfectly embodied the samurai ideal, a Taiwanese holdout represents a more complicated aspect of Japan's imperial project, its colonization and conscription of indigenous peoples throughout Asia. The Japanese embassy in Jakarta dispatches representatives to investigate, maintaining low expectations. Previous reports of holdouts had sometimes proved false, with local officials occasionally making such claims to attract attention or tourism. The Japanese public, still processing Onoda's dramatic story, pays little attention to these new rumors from a distant Indonesian island. Yet on December 18, 1974, against all expectations, Teruo Nakamura emerges from the jungle into a world that has relegated men like him to history. His appearance confounds the narrative that Onoda represented the final chapter of the holdout story. More significantly, his Taiwanese Aboriginal identity complicates the straightforward tale of Japanese military honor that Onoda's case seemed to represent. As news of Nakamura's discovery spreads, inevitable comparisons to Onoda emerge. Both men held out for approximately the same period on similar islands in the Western Pacific. Both maintained military discipline and purpose in extreme isolation. But while Onoda's story neatly aligned with traditional Japanese values of loyalty and sacrifice, Nakamura's raises uncomfortable questions about colonial subjects who fought and suffered for an empire that had claimed their lands and conscripted their bodies. In Taiwan, news of Nakamura's discovery resonates differently than in Japan. For the Taiwanese, particularly Aboriginal communities, his story represents not just military loyalty, but the complex legacy of Japanese colonization and the way imperial powers throughout history have used indigenous peoples as instruments of expansion and defense. Within days of Nakamura's surrender, journalists begin constructing the narrative of Ice the Last Holdout, positioning him as the final living embodiment of Imperial Japan's military reach. What they cannot know is that this title itself is contingent and uncertain. Rumors of other holdouts will continue to surface in the Philippines, the Solomon Islands, and elsewhere into the 1980s, though none will be confirmed with the certainty that surrounds Onoda and Nakamura. As Nakamura undergoes medical examination and debriefing at an Indonesian military facility, he knows nothing of these other holdouts or his place in their sequence. He is simply a man emerging from a private war into a public story, unaware that his individual experience is being woven into a larger tapestry of historical meaning and cultural memory. The holdouts, each in their isolation believing themselves perhaps the last loyal soldier of the emperor, form a diaspora of duty across the Pacific, men separated by islands and jungles but united by a common experience of time suspended, of war without end, of loyalty tested by decades of solitude. Nakamura, the last confirmed member of this inadvertent brotherhood, carries their collective story forward even as he writes its final chapter. November 1974, Indonesian Air Force Base, Northern Morotai. A meeting is hastily convened between Indonesian military officials and representatives from the Japanese embassy in Jakarta. An Indonesian pilot on a routine training flight had reported an unusual sight, a cleared rectangular compound in a remote valley, visible only from certain angles and clearly maintained by human hands. This was significant because the area was uninhabited according to official records, far from any recognized villages. Subsequent reconnaissance flights confirmed the presence of a solitary figure who fled into the jungle when aircraft approached. The compound's design, with defensive positions and systematic layout, suggested military training. Given the island's history and similar discoveries elsewhere in the Pacific, officials suspected they had located another Japanese holdout from World War II. The Japanese embassy, notified of the discovery, dispatched a delegation immediately. After the widely publicized surrender of Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda in the Philippines earlier that year, Japanese authorities were prepared for the possibility of finding more soldiers who had never received word of Japan's surrender. The search mission was organized with careful consideration for the psychological state of the suspected holdout. Indonesian soldiers with Japanese interpreters would approach the area carrying Japanese flags and broadcasting announcements about the war's end. They would bring photographs of contemporary Japan, official statements from the Japanese government, and recordings of the Japanese national anthem. On December 18, 1974, the search party made contact with Teruo Nakamura. After 3 decades of solitude, the moment of truth arrived with stunning abruptness. Nakamura's initial reaction was one of guarded suspicion. He observed the search party from hiding before cautiously approaching. When addressed in Japanese, he responded with halting phrases, his voice raspy from disuse. The interpreters quickly realized he was more comfortable in his native Amis language than in Japanese, confirming his Taiwanese Aboriginal origin. The search party's leader, an Indonesian captain, maintained a respectful distance, allowing Nakamura to approach at his own pace. When close enough for conversation, the Japanese interpreter explained that Japan had surrendered on August 15, 1945, over 29 years earlier. Emperor Hirohito had broadcast the surrender announcement to the Japanese people, accepting the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Nakamura listened with an impassive expression, decades of survival having taught him to hide his emotions. When shown photographs of modern Tokyo with its skyscrapers and automobiles, of Emperor Hirohito in Western clothing meeting world leaders, his eyes widened slightly, the only visible indication of his internal shock. "Is this real?" he asked in broken Japanese, his fingers tracing the unfamiliar skyline of post-war Tokyo. "Yes," the interpreter assured him. "Japan has changed much since 1945. The Indonesian captain formally requested that Nakamura accompany them to the base camp. Unlike some other holdouts who had surrendered their weapons in ceremonial fashion, Nakamura simply nodded and gathered a few personal possessions. His response lacked the dramatic emotion that had characterized Onoda's surrender. There were no tears, no passionate declarations of loyalty to the emperor. Instead, there was quiet resignation, the weary acceptance of a man who had fulfilled his duty to the absolute limits of human endurance. At the base camp, Nakamura was given a medical examination, new clothing, and proper meals. Doctors were astounded by his physical condition. Despite 3 decades in the jungle with no medical care, he was remarkably healthy, suffering mainly from malnutrition and minor tropical infections. His body bore numerous scars from injuries sustained during his long isolation, evidence of the countless challenges he had overcome alone. News of Nakamura's discovery spread quickly. Reporters converged on Morotai, eager to document the story of the last known Japanese holdout. Indonesian and Japanese officials worked to process Nakamura's case, complicated by his Taiwanese Aboriginal status and the complex post-war politics between Japan, Taiwan, and China. Unlike Onoda, who was Japanese by birth and had been commissioned as an officer, Nakamura was an indigenous Taiwanese who had been conscripted into service by an imperial power that no longer controlled his homeland. This created diplomatic complexities about his citizenship status and repatriation. Throughout these proceedings, Nakamura remained stoic and reserved. When interviewed by journalists, his responses were brief and pragmatic. Asked how he had survived so long, he simply replied, "I ate what the jungle provided." When questioned about his feelings upon learning the war had ended decades ago, he paused before answering, "I did my duty as ordered." This quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to the media frenzy surrounding him. Journalists and officials sought dramatic narratives of patriotic fervor or psychological trauma, but Nakamura offered neither. He was a man who had survived by focusing on immediate realities rather than abstract ideologies, As arrangements were made for his repatriation, a significant difference emerged between Nakamura's case and that of other holdouts. While Lieutenant Onoda had returned to Japan as a hero, receiving a substantial back pay settlement and meeting Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka, initial plans for Nakamura involved minimal compensation and repatriation directly to Taiwan, bypassing Japan entirely. This discrepancy reflected the complex status of Taiwanese who had served in the Japanese military. Though they had fought under the Japanese flag, they were often treated as second-class soldiers, their service and sacrifice valued less than those of ethnic Japanese. News of this inequitable treatment reached Japan, sparking public debate about the nation's responsibility to all who had served under its flag, regardless of ethnic origin. The controversy forced Japanese authorities to reconsider their approach to Nakamura's case. As 1974 drew to a close, Teruo Nakamura prepared to leave Morotai, the island that had been both his prison and his kingdom for 30 years. His long vigil had ended not with dramatic fanfare, but with quiet dignity, yet the implications of his remarkable story were only beginning to ripple outward, challenging Japan and the world to confront uncomfortable truths about war, duty, and the complex legacies of imperial ambition. January 8, 1975. Taitung County, Taiwan. A small turboprop aircraft touches down on the rural airstrip, its engines gradually winding down to silence. Teruo Nakamura, now officially referred to by his original Amis name, Atun Palalin, steps onto Taiwanese soil for the first time in over 30 years. The man who left as a conscripted soldier of Imperial Japan returns to a homeland that has transformed beyond recognition. Taiwan is now the Republic of China, governed by the Kuomintang after Chiang Kai-shek's retreat from the mainland in 1949. The reception is modest. No large crowds or government officials await him, only a small group including representatives from veterans, organizations, local Amis tribal leaders, and, most significantly, his wife and family. The reunion is both joyful and painful. His wife, believing him dead since 1945, had remarried years ago. His parents had passed away during his absence. His siblings, now elderly, barely recognized the weathered man before them. Most poignant is his meeting with his son, born shortly after Nakamura's departure for war, a middle-aged man encountering his father for the first time. Despite the personal complexity of his return, Nakamura maintains the same quiet dignity that characterized his surrender. There are no public displays of emotion, no dramatic speeches about his ordeal. He simply bows to those who greet him and speaks softly in his native Amis language to family members. In the days following his return, the stark contrast between Nakamura's reception and that given to Lieutenant Onoda becomes a subject of growing controversy. Onoda, the ethnic Japanese officer who surrendered in the Philippines, received 38,000 yen in back pay from the Japanese government, equivalent to roughly $14,000 in 1974. He was greeted by cheering crowds upon his return to Japan, met with the Prime Minister, and quickly signed a lucrative book deal. Nakamura, by contrast, initially received just 5,000 yen, about 17, the equivalent of a few months' salary for a private in 1944. This disparity ignited public outrage in both Taiwan and Japan. The Japanese media questioned whether this treatment reflected lingering discrimination against Taiwanese aboriginals who had served in the imperial forces. As pressure mounted, the Japanese government established the Association for the Warm Welcome of Teruo Nakamura, which raised donations totaling 4.25 million yen. This private fundraising effort helped compensate for the official shortfall, but the initial disparity remained a symbol of unresolved historical inequities. Nakamura's story forced Japan to confront uncomfortable questions about its wartime past and post-war responsibilities. Who deserved recognition for service to the empire? What obligations did modern Japan have to all who had fought under its flag, regardless of ethnicity. The debate exposed lingering tensions between Japan's self-image as a victim of the war, emphasized by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and its role as a colonial power that had drafted indigenous peoples into its military campaigns. In Taiwan, Nakamura's return coincided with a period of growing interest in Aboriginal rights and cultural preservation. His story became a powerful symbol for the Amis and other indigenous groups seeking recognition of their distinct identity and historical experiences. For the wider world, Nakamura's emergence after 3 decades in isolation captured the imagination in profound ways. Coming at the end of the Vietnam War, amid the Cold War's ongoing tensions, his story seemed to transcend politics. Here was a man who had remained true to his understanding of duty beyond any reasonable expectation, maintaining discipline and purpose in circumstances that would have broken most human spirits. Journalists and academics sought interviews with Nakamura, hoping to understand the psychology that had sustained him through 30 years of solitude. But he offered few introspective insights, responding to philosophical questions with practical answers. Asked about the meaning of his experience, he simply stated, "I did what was necessary to survive." This straightforward approach to extraordinary circumstances gave Nakamura's story a universal quality that resonated across cultural boundaries. Unlike Onoda, whose surrender had been accompanied by emotional declarations of loyalty to the emperor and expressions of shame at having failed in his mission, Nakamura presented a more nuanced image of duty, one focused on personal integrity rather than ideological fervor. In the years following his return, Nakamura established a simple life in Taiwan. He received medical treatment for conditions developed during his years in isolation and was granted a modest veteran's pension. He lived quietly with family members, gradually adjusting to modern society, though never fully acclimating to its pace and complexity. His health, remarkably preserved during his jungle years, began to decline in the late 1970s. On June 15, 1979, just 4.5 years after his return, Teruo Nakamura died of lung cancer in Taitung County, Taiwan. He was 59 years old. His funeral combined traditional Amis rituals with military honors, reflecting the dual identities that had shaped his extraordinary life. Representatives from both Taiwanese and Japanese governments attended, their presence acknowledging the complex historical legacy embodied in this one man's journey. In death, as in his surrender, Nakamura became an inadvertent symbol of duty carried to its ultimate conclusion, of the lingering consequences of war long after peace treaties are signed, of the human capacity for endurance in isolation, and of the complex questions of identity that arise at the intersections of indigenous cultures and imperial powers. Perhaps most powerfully, his story embodied a particular kind of honor, not the dramatic, ideologically driven concept celebrated in military mythology, but something more fundamental, the quiet dignity of a man who simply did what he believed was right, day after day, year after year, without expectation of recognition or reward. Decades after his death, Nakamura's legacy continues to evolve. In Japan, the last holdout has become part of a larger conversation about the nation's wartime past and its responsibilities to all who served under its flag. In Taiwan, he is remembered as an Amis tribesman whose extraordinary life illuminates both the injustices of colonial conscription and the resilience of indigenous identity. For military historians and psychologists, his 3-decade solitary vigil remains a case study in human adaptation and the power of routine and purpose to sustain the isolated mind. But perhaps Teruo Nakamura's most profound legacy is as a reminder that history is lived not just by famous leaders who make momentous decisions, but also by ordinary individuals caught in extraordinary circumstances, men and women whose personal choices in the face of overwhelming challenges can embody the deepest meanings of concepts like honor, duty, and human dignity. In a world increasingly characterized by rapid change and constant connection, the image of one man maintaining his solitary post for 30 years, faithful to a duty that the world had forgotten, continues to resonate with a power that transcends cultural boundaries, a reminder of both the costs of war and the extraordinary capacities of the human spirit.